In the late 1970s, while American engineers were etching microchips in clean rooms and testing the first space shuttle, a secret was taking shape on the wrong side of one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth. In barns and living rooms lit only by bare bulbs, two East German families were cutting and sewing thousands of squares of fabric, trying to build a machine that could carry them not just over a fence, but out of an entire system. They lived in the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, a state that called itself a workers' paradise, guarded by Soviet tanks and a secret police force that listened at walls and opened mail. To the west of them lay the Federal Republic of Germany, plugged directly into the American-led world of color television, booming consumer electronics, and transatlantic flights. At night, standing by their windows, they could pick up Western TV signals on improvised antennas, stolen glimpses of a world that had put men on the moon and was now building machines to send them into orbit and bring them back, like airplanes. On the ground, the line between those worlds was marked by steel and concrete. The inner German border ran for roughly 1,400 kilometers, a scar across hills, rivers, and farmland, backed up by fences, minefields, automatic firing devices, and watchtowers. Every 100 meters or so, a guard with a Soviet-patterned rifle watched through binoculars, ready to open fire on anyone who tried to cross. To the west, that border was a symbol, something presidents pointed to in speeches about freedom. To people like Peter and Doris Strelzik and their friends Günther and Petra Wetzel, it was a practical problem. How do you get your children past a minefield and an entire Soviet-backed army when even talking about escape could land you in prison? Peter Strelzik was an electrician and former mechanic in the East German Air Force. He understood pressure, fuel, and flame, and he knew enough physics to respect gravity. His friend, Günther Wetzel, was a bricklayer, good with his hands, and used to making solid structures with limited materials. Both men were good at fixing things. Neither one was willing to accept that their sons would grow up never seeing the other half of their own country. They had talked about escape schemes for years. Could they hike across at night? Too many patrols, too many dogs, too many mines. Could they steal or build a small airplane? Peter knew aircraft. He also knew how complicated and noisy they were, and how quickly radar would pick them up over a border designed to stop NATO jets. Then, somewhere between magazine articles, radio reports, and sheer desperation, a different idea emerged. What if they didn't try to go through the border or under it, but over it? Not in an airplane that required a runway and avionics, but in something older and simpler, a hot air balloon. They knew just enough to be dangerous. Hot air rises because it is less dense than cold air. If you wrap that hot air in a large envelope of fabric, you can lift people. If you have enough fabric, enough heat, and enough courage, you might be able to float right over the minefields and guard towers, into the radar shadows, and into the west. Of course, in the United States, hot air balloons were a hobby. People bought them, rented them, took pictures of them drifting over vineyards and fields. In the GDR, building your own balloon in a small town under the watchful eye of the Stasi was something else entirely. The first obstacle was material. They needed thousands of square feet of fabric that was light, strong, and not too porous. They could not just walk into a store and say, "We're building a balloon." So they lied. At first, they bought cheaper cotton and similar cloth, telling shopkeepers they were sewing tents or big awnings for a sailing club that didn't actually exist. Bolt by bolt, they carried fabric home, cut it into panels on the living room floor, and sewed it into long gores with domestic sewing machines. At night, the sound of the needle was another kind of ticking clock, the sound of a project that had to remain invisible to neighbors and informants. When they finally stitched together enough for a first balloon envelope, they hiked it under cover of darkness into a clearing near the border. They had built a burner out of propane cylinders intended for stoves, some pipes, and a metal tube acting as a chimney. They spread the balloon on the ground, attached the burner, and began to pump hot air into the fabric. Nothing happened. The balloon bulged, shivered, and then sagged. The fabric leaked like a sieve. The cheap cotton was too porous. The heat they needed was bleeding straight out through the weave. They had carried hundreds of pounds of cloth into the forest to discover a basic mistake. Standing there under the East German sky with the border and the Soviet-backed searchlights not far away, they made a very Western decision. Test, fail, iterate. They set the balloon on fire, burning the evidence to ash. Then they went home and started again. This time, they approached the problem like engineers. They bought small samples of different fabrics, nylon, synthetic blends, taffeta, and made miniature test balloons. They held them over pots of boiling water, measured how quickly they deflated, and watched how much heat they trapped. In a garage in Silicon Valley, that mentality was pushing microchips to run faster. In a living room in Postneck, it was being applied to cloth and thread. The winning material was taffeta, a synthetic fabric used in party dresses, smooth, light, and much less porous. So they went back to improvisation. Doris and Petra fanned out to different towns, different shops. In each one, they bought only a few meters, telling stories about school plays, church decorations, carnival costumes, or sales for boats on lakes no one ever saw. No one clerk saw the full picture. At home, they unrolled the bolts and transformed their house into a secret aerospace workshop. By the summer of 1979, the pressure to act was suffocating. The Stasi's grip was tightening. The boys were getting older. So Peter made a decision that nearly ended everything. On the night of July 3, 1979, the Strelzik family drove to a secluded area near the border with a balloon made of improved fabric and a burner ready to roar. They had decided, at the last minute, to go without the Wetzels, 4 people instead of 8, hoping a lighter load would make the math more forgiving. In the forest clearing, with only the wind in the trees and the hiss of propane for company, they spread out the balloon once again. Cold air filled the envelope as it began to rise and billow. The fabric snapped, gleaming in the light of the torch. When the balloon finally stood upright, straining against the tether ropes, they climbed onto the metal frame. Peter fed more gas into the burner, and the glow painted their faces orange. Then, with a last look at the country they were leaving behind, they cut the lines. The ground dropped away. For the first time in their lives, they were literally above the GDR, writing an invisible difference in temperature between the world below and the air above. Under them stretched a forbidden landscape of patrol roads, minefields, and fences designed with Soviet help to hold back NATO divisions, none of which had been designed to stop a handful of citizens drifting quietly overhead. The balloon climbed into cloud. Inside that cold gray, the family lost sight of the stars and the horizon. Moisture condensed on the fabric, soaking the taffeta and adding weight. The lift they had so carefully calculated on paper began to vanish. The altimeter Peter had built from a barometer told him they were no longer gaining height. Minutes later, they were sinking. They had no map that could tell them where they were. They didn't know which side of the line they were descending toward. They slammed into a wooded slope, scraping through trees, tearing the envelope, and crashing back onto East German soil, less than 200 meters short of the border. In the darkness, with children crying and fabric fluttering down around them, they realized they were still trapped. They did the only thing they could do. They pulled the burner and gas bottles away from the wreck, destroyed any evidence that could identify them, and ran, moving for hours through the night, dodging patrol tracks, knowing that any sudden flare of a searchlight could be the last thing they ever saw. At dawn, border guards found what they had left behind: torn fabric, singed seams, propane cylinders and pipes. It was like discovering wreckage from an alien craft in the forest, a flying machine that was never supposed to exist in the GDR. The East German authorities were stunned. Their entire border system had been designed to stop people on foot, in cars, or in conventional aircraft. Now, someone had tried to float over it in a homemade balloon. The Stasi launched a forensic investigation. They took samples of the fabric, studied the stitching, and traced every label and manufacturer they could find. They combed through sales records, looking for anyone who had recently bought large quantities of taffeta, nylon, or similar cloth. In newspapers, they published appeals asking for information about suspicious fabric purchases and missing gas cylinders. This was the Soviet-backed state's answer to a problem it had not anticipated: paperwork, interrogations, and a tightening of control over every imaginable material that could lift a human being into the sky. They limited how much light fabric individual citizens could buy. They stepped up patrols in rural areas. They added more searchlights, more tripwires, more technology aimed downward. Back in Posnick, Peter heard the appeals on state radio and knew exactly whose handiwork the regime was hunting. He destroyed what evidence he had left, selling his car so it could not be linked to tire tracks, burning sketches, getting rid of scraps. Then, he went to see the one man who truly understood the stakes as he did, Günther Wetzel. For a while, the failed attempt had driven the two men in different directions. Günther had been skeptical of the balloon idea, and after the first fiasco, he had seriously considered trying to build a small plane instead. Now, faced with the fact that the Stasi was actively hunting for an unidentified balloon builder, they came to a stark conclusion. If they waited, they would be found. If they were found, they would be imprisoned, their children taken from them, their families punished. Their only hope was to do something that, on paper, sounded insane: build an even bigger balloon faster than the Stasi could find them. Under that pressure, they turned their improvised project into something that, in spirit, looked very much like a startup. They refined their calculations for lift and temperature. They re-optimized the pattern of the panels to balance strength, weight, and ease of sewing. They talked through failure modes, tears, burner outages, fuel shortages, turbulence. Night after night, the sewing machines ran. Taffeta in bright colors, blue, red, yellow, was stitched into long gores, then into a massive envelope that would stand more than 25 meters tall when filled. The children were sworn to secrecy. Friends were kept in the dark. Outside, the Stasi told themselves that their grids and files were tightening the noose. Inside those houses, genuine innovation was happening under their noses. By September 1979, they were ready. Or at least as ready as two self-taught balloon engineers in a police state could ever be. They watched the weather, looking for a night when the wind high above the border would blow steadily from east to west. On the evening of September 15th, the charts and forecasts finally aligned. They loaded the rolled-up envelope, the frame, and the gas cylinders into 2 cars, along with 4 adults and 4 children. The drive to the launch site, a forested slope near the town of Oberlemnitz, felt like a one-way journey. If they were stopped and searched, it would all be over. In the clearing, they worked as quietly as they could. They spread the fabric, attached the burner, and began to inflate. The balloon reared up, a huge, striped ghost in the darkness. The children climbed onto the metal frame, clinging to the railing. The adults checked knots one last time. And then, at the worst possible moment, one of the tethers failed to release cleanly. As the balloon began to rise, still partially tied down, it tilted hard. The flame from the burner struck the side of the envelope, igniting the fabric. In an instant, all their careful planning was one gust of wind away from becoming a deadly fireball. But they had planned for that too. They had brought a fire extinguisher specifically for this scenario. They fought the flames back, stamping and spraying, clearing the burning sections a heartbeat before the damage became catastrophic. The balloon steadied, tethers finally free. Then they were no longer in East Germany. They were above it. The burner thundered. The balloon climbed 500 meters, 1,000, 2,000. The air grew thin and bitterly cold, the ground receding into a dark, featureless blur. They huddled together on the bare frame, teeth chattering, arms locked around the children. Somewhere below, border guards watched their searchlights sweep across empty ground, unaware of the huge, silent shapes sliding through the night far above their beams. A night watchman in a town along the way glimpsed something strange moving across the stars and reported an unidentified flying object. No one could quite process the idea that in a country where people needed exit visas to visit the next town, two families were crossing the Iron Curtain in a homemade aircraft. Inside the balloon's envelope, the air cooled constantly, trying to pull them back down. Peter and Günther took turns blasting the burner, then cutting it back to conserve fuel, trying to keep the envelope just hot enough to maintain altitude. Every choice was a trade-off. Spend more propane now for safety, or save it for later when they might need one last burst to clear the final line. They had no way of knowing exactly when they crossed the border. There were no lights marking the line from above, no dotted line on the ground. They flew blind, trusting the wind and their calculations. After about 28 minutes in the air, the propane started to run low. No matter how carefully they feathered the flame, the balloon began to descend. Trees rose up out of the dark, branches clawed at the fabric. They hit the ground hard, skidding and bouncing. The metal frame slammed into earth, bodies slammed into the frame. When everything stopped moving, there was a terrible silence. Then, one of the children asked the question that mattered more than any bruise. Are we in the West?
They didn't know. They had landed in a forested area. No guard towers, no fences in sight, but that didn't mean they were safe. They left the deflating balloon behind and walked, stumbling through the early morning light. And then, the clues began to appear. The farm equipment they saw in nearby fields was newer than anything allowed in the collectivized agriculture of the GDR. The houses had small signs and company names that sounded wrong for East German state enterprises. One sign read, Überlandwerk, a kind of private or regional utility you simply didn't see in the socialist East. Finally, a police car approached. It was an Audi. East German police did not drive Audis. The officers stepped out, uniforms and accents unmistakably West German. The families asked, almost afraid of the answer, "Is this the West?" The policeman smiled and told them yes, they were near the town of Naila in Bavaria, about 10 kilometers beyond the border. In that moment, in a clearing in southern Germany, 8 people who had grown up with Soviet tanks on their streets stepped into the world they had only seen on American-backed TV. They were taken in by West German authorities, given warm clothes, hot drinks, and something even more valuable, political asylum, without having to endure long months in a refugee camp. News of the escape flashed across Western media. Newspapers and television anchors described how 2 ordinary families had spent a year and a half building 3 different balloons, learning from failure, and finally crossing one of the most dangerous borders on Earth in 28 minutes of flight. Photos of the scorched patchwork envelope and the spindly metal frame ran alongside maps of the inner German border, making one thing clear. A vast Soviet-designed security apparatus had been beaten by a sewing machine, some propane, and a dream. In the United States, the story resonated immediately. It sounded like something out of a movie. And soon, it would be one. In 1982, Disney released Night Crossing, dramatizing the escape, with American and British actors portraying men and women who had turned physics lessons into a weapon against tyranny. Audiences watched in theaters as the balloon rose over barbed wire, and they felt a very specific kind of pride. The sense that, in the long contest between systems, the people risking everything were always trying to get into the world the United States led, not out of it. Back in the East, the reaction was very different. The Stasi focused on punishment and containment. Relatives of the escapees, Peter's brother Eric, his sister Maria, and her husband Eric, were arrested, interrogated, and sentenced to prison for aiding and abetting escape, even though they had not known about the plan. The message was clear. If you try to leave, your family will pay. The secret police also redoubled their efforts to make sure nothing like this happened again. They combed through their files, opened new operations aimed at monitoring the families, even in the West, and launched programs with names like Operation Pair to harass and intimidate those who had managed to escape. They tightened regulations on fabrics, welding equipment, and gas cylinders, trying to lock down every possible pathway to the sky. But some damage could not be undone. The image of that balloon drifting over the border had been burned into the global imagination. For Western observers, especially Americans, it was a perfect metaphor. On one side of the line, you had a block of countries that could deploy tanks and missiles, but which was so afraid of its own citizens that it needed walls, minefields, and machine guns to keep them from defecting. On the other side, you had a society whose most powerful weapon was attraction, a lifestyle, an economy, and a technological culture so compelling that people were willing to stake their lives on reaching it. The balloon escapes did not stop with the Strelzyks and Wetzels. A decade later, in March 1989, a man named Winfried Freudenberg attempted to flee East Berlin in an improvised gas balloon, one of the last and most tragic aerial escape attempts of the era. He and his wife inflated their balloon at a gas facility. When authorities approached, his wife jumped out at the last moment, leaving him to ascend alone in a craft that was now dangerously light. The balloon soared far higher than planned, beyond his control. Hours later, over West Berlin, Freudenberg fell to his death from a great height just months before the wall itself would come down. His body was found in a villa garden. The shredded balloon draped itself over trees and median strips, a final reminder that the border's victims included not just those shot on the ground, but those who tried to climb into the very sky to outrun a failing regime. For every successful flight, there were others that ended in capture, injury, or quiet abandonment when the risks became too obvious. The statistics of the inner German border list dozens of people killed, not just by bullets, but in crashes, drowning, electrical accidents, and desperate attempts to hijack planes. The balloons stand out precisely because they were so rare and so spectacular. After their escape, the Strelzyk and Wetzel families had to learn how to live in the world they had risked everything to reach. West German authorities granted them citizenship, housing, and financial support. Peter opened a TV and radio repair shop, working with Western consumer electronics whose performance and availability would have been unthinkable back in the GDR. Günther found work as a mechanic, maintaining trucks instead of building clandestine aircraft. They discovered that freedom came with new challenges, navigating a capitalist economy, adapting to a media-saturated culture, and dealing with sudden fame as symbols of Cold War defiance. At one point, the pressure of constant public attention drove the Strelzyks to move to Switzerland in search of a quieter life. But for all its difficulties, that life was one they had chosen, something that, back in the East, had never been an option. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in November 1989 and Germany reunified soon after, their flight was reinterpreted again. What had once been an extraordinary anomaly now looked like an early crack in a system that was already beginning to crumble. When Stasi files were opened, Peter requested his own and discovered just how close the authorities were. Informants watching, reports filed, arrest plans drawn up. Their escape had succeeded by a margin of days, maybe hours. Today, if you visit Berlin's Wall Museum or exhibitions along the former border, you can see pieces of the balloon, photographs of the families, and diagrams of their route. You can stand a few feet from the fabric that rose over guard towers and minefields, and you can read placards that explain how an electrician and a bricklayer did what entire armies could not manage. They crossed a line the Soviet bloc had sworn was impenetrable. For American viewers, these stories carry a particular charge. They are not tales of tanks clashing on open fields, but of ordinary people using knowledge, improvisation, and courage to punch holes in an authoritarian system that claimed to be historically inevitable. They echo the same themes that defined the American self-image in the Cold War, that the side building computers, rockets, and open societies would eventually out-innovate and out-inspire the side building walls. Two families, in secret, took ideas that could have come straight out of a high school physics textbook or a hobbyist magazine and turned them into a machine for freedom. They did it in a country where possessing the wrong book could get you on a watch list, where tuning your radio to the wrong frequency could draw suspicion, where the secret police believed that control over information and materials equaled control over people. They proved that was wrong. In the end, the Soviet-backed regimes of Eastern Europe could not keep up, not just militarily or economically, but imaginatively. They were shocked and humiliated by escapes that looked like something out of an adventure serial, pulled off not by commandos, but by parents with sewing machines and gas bottles. Every successful balloon, every tunnel, every improvised glider was a quiet vote of confidence in the American-led world on the other side of the fence. When you watch the footage or look at the photos of that patched-together balloon on display in a museum, you are not just seeing a clever hack of Cold War border security. You are seeing the moment when the logic of the 20th century, massive, centralized power, walls, and weapons, was outflanked by something much closer to the logic of the 21st. Small teams, smart tools, and the determination to connect with a wider world. And you are reminded that in the long, dangerous standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, the most decisive victories were not always won in summits or on battlefields, but in forests and living rooms, by people who believed that the future belonged on the side where a handmade machine could rise into the night and carry them, at last, into the open sky.